the inauguration of the first African American president, the fight for civil rights and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the integration of the United States military, all had something in common: the plight of African Americans and people of color needing to be recognized as equals. However, most of us are unaware of how much of this social progress was the result of a relatively small group, and history shows that most of the progress in these areas got a big push forward from a little-known but highly courageous group of World War II aviators known as the Tuskegee Airmen. The evidence of this is self-evident whenever we look at the American Armed Forces. No matter what branch of service we look at, we can plainly see the total integration at all levels of the service. Integration that came at a heavy price, paid for by so few for the benefit of so many. In spite of the adversity and limited opportunities, African Americans have played a significant role in U.S. military history over the past 300 years. They were denied military leadership roles and skilled training because many believed they lacked qualifications for combat duty. Young African Americans who aspired to become pilots met with significant obstacles, starting with the widespread belief at the time that black people could not learn to fly or operate sophisticated aircraft. As a result, African Americans were barred from flying for the U.S. military in the years prior to 1940. In 1938, with Europe teetering on the brink of another world war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced he would expand the civilian pilot training program in the United States. At the time, racial segregation was the rule in the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as much of the country. Much of the military establishment, particularly in the South, believed black soldiers were inferior and performed relatively poorly in combat. But as the Army Air Corps began ramping up its training program, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier joined civil rights groups like the NAACP in arguing that black Americans be included. In September 1940, Roosevelt's White House responded to such lobbying campaigns by announcing that the Army Air Corps would soon begin training black pilots. This resulted in the formation of an all-African American pursuit squadron based in Tuskegee in 1941. They became known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Tuskegee Airmen refers to all who were involved in the so-called Tuskegee Experiment, the Army Air Corps' program to train African Americans to fly and maintain combat aircraft. In May 1940, the students of the first civilian pilot training program completed their training, and the Tuskegee program then expanded to become the Center for African American Aviation during World War II. For the training site, the War Department chose the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, then under construction. Home to the prestigious Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, it was located at the heart of the Jim Crow South. The U.S. Army Air Corps had established the Psychological Research Unit 1 at Maxwell Army Airfield in Montgomery, Alabama, and other units around the country for aviation cadet training, which included the identification, selection, education, and training of pilots, navigators, and bombardiers. Psychologists employed in these research studies and training programs used some of the first standardized tests to quantify IQ, dexterity, and leadership qualities to select and train the best-suited personnel for the roles of bombardier, navigator, and pilot. The Air Corps determined that the existing programs would be used for all units, including all black units. At Tuskegee, this effort continued with the selection and training of the Tuskegee Airmen. The War Department set up a system to accept only those with a level of flight experience or higher education, which ensured that only the most able and intelligent African American applicants were able to join. The program's trainees, nearly all of them college graduates or undergraduates, came from all over the country. In addition to some 1,000 pilots, the Tuskegee program trained nearly 14,000 navigators, bombardiers, instructors, aircraft and engine mechanics, control tower operators, and other maintenance and support staff. Among the 13 members of the first class of aviation cadets in 1941 was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a graduate of West Point and the son of Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis, one of only 2 black officers, other than chaplains, in the entire U.S. military. The Tuskegee experiment took a great leap forward on April 1941, thanks to a visit by Eleanor Roosevelt. Charles Chief Anderson, then the chief flight instructor in the program, took the First Lady on an aerial tour, and photos and film of that flight helped publicize the program. During training, Tuskegee Army Airfield was first commanded by Major James Ellison. Ellison made great progress in organizing the construction of the facilities needed for the military program at Tuskegee. However, he was transferred on 12 January 1942, reputedly because of his insistence that his African American sentries and military police had military authority over local Caucasian civilians. His successor, Colonel Frederick von Kimball, then oversaw operations at the Tuskegee Airfield. Contrary to new Army regulations, Kimball maintained segregation on the field in defense of local customs in the state of Alabama, a policy that was resented by the airmen. Later that year, the Air Corps replaced Kimball. His replacement had been Director of Training at Tuskegee Army Airfield, Major Noel F. Parrish. Despite the racism of the day, Parrish was fair and open-minded and petitioned Washington to allow the Tuskegee Airmen to serve in combat. The strict racial segregation the U.S. Army required gave way in the face of the requirements for complex training and technical vocations. Typical of the process was the development of separate African American flight surgeons to support the operations and training of the Tuskegee Airmen. Before the development of this unit, no U.S. Army flight surgeons had been black. Training of African American aviation medical examiners was conducted through correspondence courses until 1943, when 2 black physicians were admitted to the U.S. Army School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Field, Texas. This was the earliest racially integrated courses in the U.S. Army. 17 flight surgeons served with the Tuskegee Airmen from 1941 to 1949. At that time, the typical tour of duty for a U.S. Army flight surgeon was 4 years. 6 of these physicians lived under field conditions during operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The chief flight surgeon to the Tuskegee Airmen was Vance H. Marchbanks, Jr., M.D., a childhood friend of Benjamin O. Davis. The Tuskegee Airmen were finally considered ready for combat duty by April 1943. They shipped out of Tuskegee on 2nd April, bound for North Africa, where they would join the 33rd Fighter Group and its commander, Colonel William W. Momyer. Given little guidance from battle-experienced pilots, the 99th's first combat mission was to attack the small strategic island of Pantelleria, codenamed Operation Corkscrew, in the Mediterranean Sea to clear the sea lanes for the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. The air assault on the island began 30th May 1943. The 99th flew its first combat mission on 2nd June. The surrender of the garrison of 11,121 Italians and 78 Germans due to air attack was the first of its kind. The 99th then moved on to Sicily and received the Distinguished Unit Citation for its performance in combat. By the end of February 1944, the all-black 332nd Fighter Group had been sent overseas with 3 fighter squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd. Under the command of Colonel Davis, the squadrons were moved to mainland Italy, where the 99th Fighter Squadron joined them on 6 June at Ramitelli Airfield. From Ramitelli, the 332nd Fighter Group escorted 15 Air Force heavy strategic bombing raids into Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Poland, and Germany. Flying escort for heavy bombers, the 332nd earned an impressive combat record. The Allies called these airmen Red Tails, or Red-Tailed Angels, because of the distinctive crimson unit identification marking predominantly applied to the tail section of the unit's aircraft. A B-25 bomb group, the 477th Bombardment Group, was forming in the United States, but was not able to complete its training in time to see action. The 99th Fighter Squadron, after its return to the United States, became part of the 477th, redesignated the 477th Composite Group. The new group's first commanding officer was Colonel Robert Selway, who had also commanded the 332nd Fighter Group before it deployed for combat overseas. Like his ranking officer, Major General Frank O'Driscoll Hunter from Georgia, Selway was a racial segregationist. Hunter was blunt about it, saying such things as racial friction will occur if colored and white pilots are trained together. He backed Selway's violations of Army Regulation 210-10, which forbade segregation of air base facilities. Together, they segregated base facilities so thoroughly that they even drew a line in the base theater and ordered separate seating by races. African American officers petitioned Base Commanding Officer William Boyd for access to the only officers' club on the base. Lieutenant Milton Henry entered the club and personally demanded his club rights. He was later court-martialed for his actions. Subsequently, Colonel Boyd denied club rights to African Americans, although General Hunter stepped in and promised a separate but equal club would be built for black airmen. The 477th was transferred to Godman Field, Kentucky before the club was built. They had spent 5 months at Selfridge, but found themselves on a base a fraction of Selfridge's size, with no air-to-ground gunnery range and deteriorating runways that were too short for B-25 landings. Colonel Selway took on the second role of commanding officer of Godman Field. In that capacity, he ceded Godman Field's Officers Club to African American airmen. Caucasian officers used the Whites-Only Club at nearby Fort Knox, much to the displeasure of African American officers. Another irritant was a professional one. They observed the steady flow of white officers through the command positions of the group and squadrons. These officers stayed just long enough to be promotable before transferring out at their new rank. This seemed to take about 4 months. In an extreme example, 22-year-old Robert Mattern was promoted to captain, transferred into squadron command in the 477th days later, and left a month later as a major and was replaced by another Caucasian officer. Meanwhile, no Tuskegee Airmen held command. On 15 March 1945, the 477th was transferred to Freeman Field near Seymour, Indiana. The white population of the Freeman Field was 250 officers and 600 enlisted men. Superimposed on it were 400 African American officers and 2,500 enlisted men of the 477th and its associated units. Freeman Field had a firing range, usable runways, and other amenities useful for training. African American airmen would work in proximity with white airmen, and both would live in a public housing project adjacent to the base. The only black air units that saw combat during the war were the 99th Pursuit Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group. The dive bombing and strafing missions under Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. were considered to be highly successful. In May 1942, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was renamed the 99th Fighter Squadron. It earned 3 Distinguished Unit citations during World War II. The DUCs were for operations over Sicily, Monastery Hill near Cassino, and for successfully fighting off German jet aircraft in March of 1945, which was the longest bomber escort mission of the 15th Air Force throughout the war. The 332nd flew missions in Sicily, Anzio, Normandy, the Rhineland, the Po Valley, and Rome, Arno, and others. Pilots of the 99th once set a record for destroying 5 enemy aircraft in under 4 minutes. The Tuskegee Airmen shot down 3 German jets in a single day. On 24 March 1945, 43 P-51 Mustangs, led by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, escorted B-17 bombers over 1,600 miles into Germany and back. The bombers' target, a massive Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin, was heavily defended by Luftwaffe aircraft, including propeller-driven F-190s, an Me-163 Comet rocket-powered fighters, and 25 of the much more formidable Me-262s, history's first operational jet fighter. Pilots Charles Brantley, Earl Lane, and Roscoe Brown all shot down German jets over Berlin that day. For the mission, the 332nd Fighter Group earned a Distinguished Unit Citation. Their missions took them over Italy and enemy-occupied parts of Central and Southern Europe. Their operational aircraft were in succession: the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the Bell P-39 Airacobra, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the North American P-51 Mustang fighter aircraft. In all, 992 pilots were trained in Tuskegee from 1941 to 1946. 355 were deployed overseas and 84 lost their lives. The toll included 68 pilots killed in action or accidents, 12 killed in training and non-combat missions, and 32 captured as prisoners of war. The Tuskegee Airmen were credited with the following accomplishments: 1,578 combat missions, 1,267 for the 12th Air Force, 311 for the 15th Air Force, 179 bomber escort missions, with a good record of protection, losing bombers on only 7 missions and a total of only 27, compared to the average of 46 among other 15th Air Force P-51 groups. Their awards and decorations include 3 Distinguished Unit Citations, at least 1 Silver Star, 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 various air medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. Contrary to negative predictions from some quarters, Tuskegee Airmen were some of the best pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces due to a combination of pre-war experience and the personal drive of those accepted for training. Nevertheless, the Tuskegee Airmen continued to have to fight racism. Their combat record did much to quiet those directly involved with the group, but other units continued to harass these airmen. In 1949, the 332nd entered the annual U.S. Continental Gunnery Meet in Las Vegas, Nevada. Flying the long-range Republic P-47N Thunderbolt, built for the long-range escort mission in the Pacific Theater of World War II, the 332nd Fighter Wing took first place in the conventional fighter class. They received congratulations from the government of Ohio and Air Force commanders across the nation. After segregation in the military was ended in 1948 by President Harry S. Truman with Executive Order 9981, the veteran Tuskegee Airmen now found themselves in high demand throughout the newly formed United States Air Force. Some taught in civilian flight schools, such as the black-owned Columbia Air Center in Maryland. On 11 May 1949, Air Force Letter 35.3 was published, which mandated that black airmen be screened for reassignment to formerly all-white units according to qualifications. United States Air Force General Daniel Chappie James Jr., then lieutenant, was an instructor of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later a fighter pilot in Europe. In 1975, he became the first African American to reach the rank of 4-star general. Post-war commander of the 99th Squadron, Marion Rogers, went on to work in communications for NORAD and as a program developer for the Apollo 13 project. On 29 March 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded a Congressional Gold Medal at a ceremony in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. The medal is currently on display at the Smithsonian Institution. The airfield where the airmen trained is now the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. Thurgood Marshall, the future Supreme Court Justice, got his start defending Tuskegee bomber trainees. The 477th Bombardment Group was formed in 1944 to extend the so-called Tuskegee experiment by allowing black aviators to serve on bomber crews. The aim was to send pilots, many of them veterans of the original Tuskegee Fighter Group, back to the States for training on B-25 bombers. While in Indiana, some of the African American officers were arrested and charged with mutiny after entering an all-white officers' club. Marshall, then a young lawyer, represented the 100 black officers who had landed in jail as a result of the confrontation. The men were soon released. Robert W. Williams, Jr., a navigator bombardier in the 477th Bombardment Group, became a judge in the 1st Judicial District, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In 1979, he was elected to the Commonwealth Court, an appellate court, and the first African American to serve on that court. In 1985, he resigned from the court to run for the district attorney of Philadelphia County. He was the first African American to successfully become a citywide candidate for that office. In 2021, the U.S. Mint will issue an America the Beautiful quarter commemorating the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. The coin depicts a Tuskegee Airman suiting up with two P-51 Mustangs flying overhead and the motto, "They fought two wars." The Tuskegee Airmen overcame segregation and prejudice to become one of the most highly respected fighter groups of World War II. They proved conclusively that African Americans could fly and maintain sophisticated combat aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen's achievements, together with the men and women who supported them, paved the way for full integration of the U.S. military. They truly suffered the pain of progress.
I have a dream today. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.